In 1957, archaeologists tunneling into the sealed tomb of King Midas near Ankara, Turkey, found something nobody expected. The tomb contained the largest collection of Iron Age drinking equipment ever discovered: 157 bronze buckets, vats, and bowls. When scientists analyzed the residue inside those vessels, they found traces of one of the oldest known fermented alcoholic drinks in human history. A University of Pennsylvania archaeologist named Patrick McGovern spent his entire career chasing findings like that one. And what he concluded about the relationship between alcohol and the birth of human civilization will change the way you think about why we became who we are. McGovern spent decades traveling the world, scraping residue from the insides of ancient clay pots, stone vessels, and bronze containers. He called himself a biomolecular archaeologist. Everyone else called him the Indiana Jones of ancient ales. His central argument was simple and deeply unsettling. Humans didn't start farming because they needed food. They started farming because they needed to make alcohol. And the evidence he spent a lifetime accumulating is genuinely hard to dismiss. Here is the problem with the standard story of agriculture. The standard story goes like this. Hunter-gatherers started growing crops because it was a more reliable food supply than hunting and gathering. It makes intuitive sense, but when you look at the actual tools and actual grain varieties found at the earliest farming sites, something doesn't add up. In Mexico, the earliest cultivated crop was a grass called teosinte, a primitive ancestor of corn. But teosinte is barely edible. It has a tough outer shell, almost no starch, and makes terrible flour. It is, however, excellent for fermentation. The earliest Mexicans were making chicha, a fermented alcoholic drink made from teosinte, long before they figured out how to selectively breed the plant into something you could actually eat. The corn we grow today for food took thousands of additional years of agricultural development to produce, but the chicha was available almost immediately from the first harvest. The same pattern appears in the ancient Near East. Solomon Katz, an anthropology professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1980s, argued that bread was not particularly popular with early civilizations in the Middle East. What they were doing with their grain, Katz argued, was brewing it. Patrick McGovern backed him up with biochemical data. Beer, McGovern found, was actually more nutritious than early bread. It contained more B vitamins and the essential amino acid lysine, which is largely absent from plain grain. In a world before refrigeration, before medicine, before understanding of nutrition, beer was not just a luxury, it was a meaningful source of calories and nutrients that plain grain couldn't provide. But the most striking piece of evidence for the beer before farming theory comes from a site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, the oldest known temple complex on Earth, built approximately 11,600 years ago, nearly 7,000 years before Stonehenge. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. They had not yet invented farming, and yet they gathered there in large numbers, repeatedly, for what archaeologists believe were massive communal feasts. Inside the stone enclosures, researchers from the German Archaeological Institute found 6 large limestone vessels, barrel and trough shaped, with capacities of up to 160 liters each. Dr. Martin Zarnko of the Technical University of Munich analyzed the chemical residue on the walls of those vessels. He found calcium oxalate, a compound that develops specifically during the soaking, mashing, and fermenting of grain. In other words, the world's oldest known temple had a brewery. The people gathering to build one of the most complex structures in prehistoric history were, in all likelihood, doing it over beer. Oliver Dietrich of the German Archaeological Institute put it plainly. The evidence at Göbekli Tepe, he said, supports the idea that brewing was one of the earliest known uses of managed wild grain, possibly predating or co-developing with bread making itself. What brought people together to build this enormous structure long before farming had been invented may have been the promise of alcohol. And once people were gathering in large enough numbers, regularly enough, farming to sustain that gathering became necessary. That is McGovern's core argument. Alcohol didn't follow civilization. Alcohol created the conditions for civilization. The communal act of drinking, the ritual, the gathering, the shared experience, built social bonds between groups of people who might otherwise never have cooperated. It funded the first temples, it motivated the first large-scale agriculture, and it may have been the single most important social technology in human history. Patrick McGovern died in August 2025. He spent 45 years at the University of Pennsylvania, analyzing ancient residues, reconstructing ancient beverages, and arguing that our fondness for alcohol is not a modern vice. It is a biological inheritance that stretches back millions of years to a primate ancestor who learned that the smell of fermented fruit meant the fruit was ripe, safe, and calorie-rich. In his book, he called our species not just Homo sapiens, but Homo imbibans, drinking man. And looking at the evidence he left behind, in the residues of 9,000-year-old Chinese rice beer, in the calcium oxalate on Göbekli Tepe's limestone troughs, in the 157 bronze drinking vessels from King Midas's tomb, it is very hard to argue that he was wrong.
We didn't discover beer after we built civilization. We built civilization around beer. And somewhere along the way, we forgot that it was ever anything other than just a drink.